Welcome to Inside the Lords. This week, I just want to try and untangle why lawmaking is so complicated and the kind of mess that you can get into. Um, we've actually arrived at the report stage of the Public Order Bill. This is the bill which is largely being used to put a whole range of criminal offences associated with going on protests. And when you get to report stage, when people put amendments in, rather than just being where you talk and debate, they actually often come to a vote. And so they actually can amend the law. What then happens is the law, as amended in the Lords, gets sent back to the Commons, and the Commons review what the Lords have done, send it back if they accept any of the amendments or what have you, and then you have that ping pong, which I've talked about before. So we're at report stage. So it's been quite acrimonious, to say the least, because in some ways the demands for the bill were that we had to deal with Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil protests. And as you'll know, they called off those kind of protests. And one of the reasons they called them off is because so many people have been arrested with the law as it's presently laid out. So the question is obviously, why do you need these new laws, especially if they call off the protests? And my argument always has been that there's a policing crisis. We have the laws on the statute book that could deal with any public order affairs, but that the police just won't enact them and are kind of seem to be hamstrung or ambivalent about how they behave in relation to some of the protests that have caused the public so much grievance and annoyance and so on when they can't get to work. But in addition to that, the danger is that you give a lot of powers to the Secretary of State, to the state per se, to the police, and they won't just be used for Just Stop Oil protesters. They could be used on any protest. Anyway, on two of the amendments that we've discussed on earlier this week, the government lost, and they were not necessarily expecting to lose. So that's amended the bill, and that's the way it will go back to the Commons. Also, and I think this was on Monday, we were discussing another part of the Public Order Bill, which is an odd one, where you will know there's been a big debate about whether there should be a legal mandate, a national mandate, that every facility that provides abortion, whether that's private abortion clinics, charities like BPAS, Mary Stopes, but any hospital in which you can have a determination whether there should be a 150-metre buffer zone around them, and any activity in that buffer zone, as described in the law, would then be a criminal offence. So I am very pro-choice, very pro. I think that women should be able to access a medical procedure without being hassled by a load of people outside. I've completely got every sympathy with both the staff in those clinics and women walking in, but think it's very dangerous to bring in a criminal law against people standing outside in a public space. At the moment, these problems are dealt with by public space protection orders, which are sought after locally. Now what we've got is a demand that they should be national. Originally, there was a clause 9, and at committee stage, where you have amendments but you don't vote, this clause 9 was so draconian and so authoritarian that I think everybody agreed with my amendments that it just needed to be altered, or it would be a real serious threat to the right to protest in general, let alone the right to free speech, despite sympathy with women trying to access terminations, not having to walk past a lot of people praying or, waving placards about. Actually, the person who put forward Clause 9 amendment, Baroness Sugg, Liz Sugg, was, I think did the right thing. She really listened hard to the arguments, and she came back now at report stage with a much milder version of the same clause, completely rewritten, in fact. And in my speech, I commended her for listening, but I wanted to say, and this is where the lawmaking matters, that I thought there was real problems with it. One, I do not think that this should be nationally mandated around these clinics, even when there are no problems, or that means that you're taking precautionary action of carving out public space and saying you can't do something in it, even when there aren't even any issues locally. And secondly, I wanted to take issue with one word. You might think, well, what's a word in a piece of law? Which basically said that you should be prohibited with criminal sanction if you did it from influencing women seeking terminations. And I thought to make it a criminal offence that in a public space that you would influence somebody was a very dangerous precedent to set. Because it's one thing, of course, women shouldn't be harassed, they shouldn't be even harangued, but influencing, to use that word, and people were sort of trying, Liz Sugg kept saying, and her supporters kept saying, oh, influencing, it's just what's in a word. But I think that we can see from what's happened in Scotland with the Gender Recognition Act, as is, the way that things are worded actually has implications, and that's why I made such a fuss of it. I also happen to think that women who seek terminations are able to are open at any point to be influenced by anyone, and that's not something that we should object to. And I'm going to write about this in more detail, but that was what happened. I was arguing in preference because I also changed my position a bit. I tried to amend clause 9 before, but I wanted to change my mind and say I'd heard so many conflicting sides of the argument that when I kept citing the review that the government had called, the Home Office called in 2018, saying that there was absolutely no justification for, or it was disproportionate to have a national ban, I kept quoting that. Liz Sugg and her supporters kept saying it's out of date, it doesn't exist. So I went along with Lord Farmer's idea that we should have a review. Then what happened was that we called a vote. This is the bit that was also fascinating to me. Usually they call about, they say how many people, content, not content. People go content, not content. But that's just a formal thing as far as I was concerned. And then you actually go down the voting corridors. In this instance, it was pretty obvious that the review that Lord Farmer was calling for, backed by me, didn't have maximum support. But so when they said not content, all the people who opposed Lord Farmer's review and my amendment shouted not content very loudly, and those who said content, we didn't shout that loudly. I mean, because it was a formal procedure, I don't even know if I shouted at all. I was just waiting to go and vote. And then the chair called it again, and again it was kind of much louder on one side. And he then said, no division of the House is necessary, no formal vote. He took the vote by acclamation, it's called. So basically it was who shouted the loudest. Now, if I'd have known, I might have shouted a bit louder, to be frank. And I had never seen that happen in the House of Lords before. So apparently it's quite rare. It saves time because the voting process means you have to queue up and all the rest of it. And it is true that I was under no illusion to the fact that Liz Sugg's amendment would pass, that the review would not pass. But I thought on a matter of conscience, and especially because, for example, the Conservatives had given their side a free vote, that it would have been good to have actually recorded our votes. And of course you can't record if you're just shouting. So that was an interesting thing that happened. But I do think that it illustrated to me that, the process of making law is a tricky one, but it's changed substantially because even in the Lords, the people who were putting forward Clause 9 have changed the law, have changed their amendment. That's now gone back to the Lords. And although I lost, I think it was an improvement based on the previous debate. I also think, though, that it's important that some people who can look on will say, why did you bother making an opposition to Liz Sugg on the basis of a word? And I just think that since I've been in the Lords, that the importance of the way a piece of legislation is written and what words signify is important. And as I say, could lead to somebody being arrested or criminalised and sets precedent. So that's why I made a fuss about it. And I've referred to the GRR. I think I would like to recommend as one of our previous Substacks from last week, in fact, in which Rob Lyons assesses the bad laws that have been made, not just the gender recognition law in Scotland, but actually there's a whole history of the Scottish Parliament making laws that when they're tested just don't stand up to scrutiny and fall apart. And that's because of the wording, because they have just basically used the law to try and hammer home a political point in preference to thinking about what that might mean. One of the things I am looking forward to, and you'll be able to see it on this Substack, is that as we speak, our colleague Ella Whelan, who is usually filming these, but in fact we've got Tom Collier doing it today, but Ella is flying up to Scotland to be on Question Time tonight, BBC's Question Time on the telly, and I suspect that the whole question of gender recognition is going to be fairly key, especially because India Willoughby is one of the participants and the well-known trans woman activist. So I think watch that, because we'll have the link to it in this Substack, and also read through Rob Lyon's assessment of the problems of bad law. The second thing that happened this week was that we had the long-awaited second reading of the online safety bill. The second reading is just where you make general comments as to what you feel about the bill, and we got 4 minutes each, which is really not enough. But anyway, you have to sort of just say where you stand on it. The interesting thing about the online safety bill is a lot of the scrutiny has happened before it actually went to the Commons or has arrived at Lords, in what is known as pre-legislative scrutiny. That's been going on for about 3 years. So the bill has been through lots and lots of iterations before it even got into Parliament. And that's an indication of what I think should happen, why you should get rid of the House of Lords, because I think the scrutiny should happen in just one house and happen before you bring it to Parliament. But it's changed substantially, so I have got detailed and copious notes on a version of the online safety bill that now no longer pertains to reality, because every time I go to critique something, it's no longer there. It's changed so much. But anyway, that was what we were. Now the updated online safety bill is with us. Just in terms of what was said yesterday, I think for those of you who are interested in free speech, a lot of us have been waiting for this because we're worried about the online safety bill being a real threat to free speech. And I'm afraid to tell you that there was only a very small minority of people in the House of Lords who raised free speech objections at all. Mainly, the objection to the bill was that it was not censorious enough, or rather not regulatory enough, not hard enough. Calls to bring back the lawful but harmful clauses, which at least the government had dropped because they were one of the most frightening aspects, but oh no, loads of people want them back. A conflation of childhood and adulthood. I made the point if it was only focusing on children, that would be much better, but it seeped into adulthood. I thought it was fascinating that one of the baronesses, Baroness Benjamin, Flo Benjamin, for those of you who used to watch children's TV, lots of people remember her as a presenter. She actually stood up and said that her final remarks were, childhood lasts a lifetime. The problem with that is that it basically encourages the state to treat us like children as adults, and that's one of the problems with a lot of the discussion that we had, that adults need to be protected from harmful content by the grown-ups in the room, as in the state, the policing bodies, Ofcom, and so on. One of the things that came through from a lot of people was Baroness Kennedy of the Shores, Helena Kennedy, who's a big human rights lawyer. We normally say that free speech is part of her remit. This is to quote her. She said, "Unlike the United States, we have not fetishized freedom of speech. There has to be occasions when we restrict freedom of speech to protect people." Now, for a human rights lawyer to basically imply that those of us who were really focusing on the free speech concerns of the bill, to say, oh, well, we don't fetishize free speech, is really to downgrade it as some kind of second order value in society. And that was a common thread in a lot of the speeches yesterday, and very disconcerting. If you want a flavour of the speeches, I thought we heard some very fine speeches, but particularly let me commend one by David Frost that I thought was very measured. Lord Frost, obviously my own, but that's just like part of the course. And the tour de force of the day, the absolutely brilliant speech of the day, was Daniel Moylan, Lord Moylan, which is very funny, right at the end, livened us all up, and basically made the point that the government was boasting it wants to be the safest place to be online in the world, and commended that we all went to China if we wanted that, making the point that the safest would mean the most censorious. Okay, so what will happen with that bill now, the online safety bill, is that we will go to committee stage. I will be putting in some amendments, and we'll see how far they go. At committee stage, you don't vote on them, but I will at least be trying to test out whether I can garner more free speech support, whether there are any members of the House of Lords who are prepared to back me, so that if it ever did go to a vote, I might at least register a free speech objection to the bill. Next week, we've got the retained EU law bill. This is going to be a major row because obviously it relates to Brexit, and the House of Lords, as we know, is notorious for being one of the arch Remainer establishment places. In fact, it was the source of practically all of the attempts at overthrowing the 2016 EU referendum emanated from people in the House of Lords. And that mood continues. Of course, we've just passed the 3rd anniversary of the when we actually formally left the EU. So the House of Lords has been having a whale of a time going on about how disastrous Brexit has been and so on. So when it comes to the retained EU law bill, which is the debate happening on Monday, I can tell you that there's not very many of us who are going to be arguing why it's a good thing that the UK is in charge of its laws rather than the EU, so watch that. And I've also included a link here from the Today programme, who I thought it was very good of them. Radio 4's Today programme organised a debate on that 3rd anniversary. They had Jacob Rees-Mogg on, they had myself on, and they had Alistair Campbell on the opposition, and then the head of the CBI as well. Listen to the discussion. I think it was quite balanced. I didn't do the boosterish all going brilliantly as Rees-Mogg did. I was much more, I hope, realistic about the fact that many people who voted to leave the EU are fed up and disillusioned, but they're fed up because we've had it exposed to us that UK politicians who are answerable to us, unlike when laws are made in the EU, are not up to scratch. And and Boris Johnson squandered the major majority he had. So I try and do that. The exciting bit of the evening was that we had a heckler, and the BBC didn't know how to cope because this heckler heckled me, said I shouldn't be in the House of Lords, called everyone liars, Tories, scum, usual stuff. Lots of that going on. And then it soon became apparent that in fact it was Steve Bray, the person who is famous for standing outside Parliament and screaming and shouting and playing very loud music and so on, one-man Remainer protest. He was dragged out by the BBC security guards eventually. And you could say, and people will say, oh, well, he had his freedom of speech destroyed in that instance. I say nothing. I wasn't bothered by his heckles, even though they were disruptive. But I did quite enjoy him being taken down a peg or two, and that it was the BBC what did it, an unusual turn-up. So see you next week, and I will report on how I get on fighting off the Remainiacs in the House of Lords.